or exuberance was targeted for immediate extinction. President Increase Mather, not widely known for his levity or spirit of abandon, was especially determined about this subject. In 1693, for instance, he and the corporation issued a solemn edict prohibiting members of the senior class from eating plum cakes during commencement week. The penalty was literally payment of a fine of 20 shillings for every offensive slice of plum cake that any student swallowed. There were several subsequent corporation thunderbolts like that during the next 30 years, aimed not only at plum cakes, but also roasted and boiled meats, pies, and distilled liquors of any kind. But nonetheless, the general drift in the direction of unabashed commencement festivity proved very difficult to stop. Looking back, it's difficult to believe that this prolonged suppression of the collective undergraduate id was really very healthy. As events transpired, the id had its own sweet revenge. During the early to mid-1700s, commencement came to look less and less like a requiem and more like a carnival. It became an official holiday for all of Massachusetts. It was nearly the biggest jamboree, except for the 4th of July later on, in the whole state. People came from the entire province and stayed an entire week. The total event was a sort of 18th century academic Woodstock, with here and there a little Latin and quite a bit less Greek. The Cambridge Common, for instance, was filled with tents. Quote, wrote one observer, quote, "Here was a knot of gamblers gathered around a wheel of fortune at a roulette table. Further along, hucksters displayed their wares. There was an auction. Here was a pantomime show. Organ grinders, bears, monkeys, jugglers, and sword swallowers all mingled in inextricable confusion. From morning till midnight there was gambling, drinking, swearing, dancing, and fighting," unquote. Matters became so bad, in fact, that the sheriff, the very sheriff we saw earlier today, was called in. It quickly became clear, however, that reinforcements would soon be critical. Within a few years, a constable with 6 additional men came to the rescue. By the early 19th century, 2 special judges were assigned to be present throughout commencement week, with an expanded guard of now 20 constables whose mission was to make arrests while the judges dispensed justice right here on the spot. Somewhere around 1830, matters took a different turn. A generous dose of Victorian decorum, like a massive sedative, began slowly to tranquilize this phantasmagoric Fellini-esque sideshow. Thus began the long journey that has finally led us to the present moment. On the way, we were clearly helped by an infusion of later 20th century informality, relaxation, and a little loss of inhibition. The result is what we now possess: spirited, congenial, celebratory, mildly anarchic, but supremely civilized in its ceremony. For several magical hours, the potentially rebellious id, the normally assertive ego, and the massive Harvard collective institutional superego managed to keep one another in check, allowing all of us who gather here to coexist in a state of uniquely crimson equilibrium. What do these hours actually represent, and why do we come back time and again, and why does this day seem to hold so much meaning for us? Well, of course, there is no one reason. There are many reasons. But at bottom, I think the real reason is that education symbolizes so much in our society, and this university has played such a strong, powerful role, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of countless others. It has become a beacon, not only of academic or educational excellence, but of important ideas of freedom. Freedom of the kind that does draw us together in a very special association, not only when we are students, but for a lifetime afterward. A suspenseful major event, one that occurred in September 1943, may help to illustrate what I mean. Harvard undertook to award then an honorary degree to someone who was first described only as a, quote, former naval person, unquote. The event was kept secret until almost the day it occurred. The Second World War was raging. September 1943 was only 9 months before D-Day, and the moment was still full of great danger for the world. On the appointed day, Harvard was filled with crowds as far as one could see. Even so, very few people really could quite believe that the Right Honorable Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, Prime Minister of England, in the midst of all this hazardous and his weighty duties, would actually make a pilgrimage to a small city called Cambridge, Massachusetts, mainly to participate in a ceremony in which he would receive an extremely small piece of parchment. Of course, the Prime Minister did arrive. The degree was conferred in Sanders Theater, and David McCord, the editor of the Harvard Alumni Bulletin at the time, described the scene as Mr. Churchill rose to speak. On either side of him towered the white marble statues of President Quincy and the colonial patriot James Otis. The Prime Minister searched for his glasses with hands that reached more happily for a cigar. As he began to talk, his mobile face and restless arms gave fluid emphasis to what he was saying. At one point, McCord reported, Churchill spoke with special emphasis. And here, stated the Prime Minister, here let me say how proud we ought to be, young and old, to be living in a tremendous, thrilling, formative epoch in the human story, and how fortunate it was for the world that when these great trials came upon us, there was a generation that terror could not conquer and brutal violence could not enslave. The cheering reverberated, Mr. McCord wrote, throughout the echoes of the old theater. The power of the Prime Minister's words had found their mark. He looked pleased, unquote. Today, as we remember that moment in late 1943, I think we can see it was no accident that Mr. Churchill chose a university, and particularly Harvard, for his secret pilgrimage. He did so because he wanted to talk about the coming victory, which he already foresaw, over forces that did not simply want to win, but also wanted to destroy genuine freedom of thought, as well as entire populations of people. By speaking at Harvard, the Prime Minister's message about true intellectual as well as other kinds of freedom would be unmistakable. At a university, he would not be identifying himself or his message with any particular partisan point of view or with any specific religious creed or doctrine or what we might call today a special interest. In other words, he deliberately chose a place that could symbolize in its purest form the very basic freedoms and values that he and others were fighting to preserve. Respect for individuals and their independence, especially for the right to inquire and think and express oneself freely, for the conviction that other individuals and peoples, not just one's own, must also be left free, must be treated with decency and dignity so that they too can lead fruitful and peaceful lives. Now, of course, many institutions in a democratic society like ours are committed to these ideals and help to carry them out. But the university is that one single institution in a society deliberately and fully dedicated all the time to the life of the mind and all its associated humane values across all fields of inquiry and learning. It is the one place where the free and disciplined activity of the mind and the broad education of individuals lies at the very center of the institution's purposes and very reason for being, and where these activities are constantly protected as well as nourished. So as we watch and participate in the festivities of our commencements, the awarding of the degrees and prizes, the processions and the academic gowns, the vestigial Latin that is read but that no one virtually ever understands. When we take part in all this festivity, we can also take pleasure in its different meanings. Some of these meanings are personal and familial. We have come to be with our children and grandchildren to see them graduate from Harvard, or perhaps to graduate ourselves, or we have come to join in reunions, to see old friends, and to visit quadrangles and courtyards and rooms where we once walked and talked and lived and rejoiced. But we are also here because, as the former naval person and prime minister recognized, this university is one of the great free sanctuaries in our modern life. It is quintessentially a place not only where students and faculty pursue their studies, but where graduates and friends and families of every generation come together, from every nation and every part of this nation, of different religions and races, with different points of view, and where all of you will always be welcome and always be invited to return and feel at home. Such sanctuaries and associations are, as I think you know, extremely rare in life and on this planet. Very few great ones exist or have ever existed anywhere. To possess an institution like this one that gathers us under the common banner of values as profound and as necessary as genuine freedom of thought and education, an institution that is generously inclusive and does not ask at the front door what party or sect or group you belong to and why. An institution that can therefore symbolize the possibility and ideal of unity, even if we do not always realize it, of a wholeness greater than the scattered parts of our unsteadied world and often fragmented parts of our individual lives. To be able to come together at a university that today joins in fellowship the members of Harvard's 50th reunion class who participated in a war that united the country, with the members of Harvard's 25th reunion class who experienced a very different war that sometimes divided the country. To have such an institution anywhere, at any time, in any society, is itself a great treasure and worthy of our constant care. To be able, finally, to be genuine participants in this university, full members of its community, part of the long sweep of its continuity over centuries, to be true participants as we are, that is something very fortunate indeed. So let us relish and rejoice in what we have been given, in all that it stands for. By all means, let us consume as many plum cakes as we can possibly digest, and imbibe some moderate portion of distilled liquors, as well as the atmosphere of freedom all around us. Linger, savor the place while you are here. Return whenever you can. This is one of your homes, one of your permanent spiritual residences, always open at the front door. Thank you for coming. Farewell and Godspeed.
Thank you, Neil, for a wonderful address. Please rise and join in the singing of Radcliffe Now We Rise to Greet Thee. Years ago, Vice President Al Gore received a degree in government with honors from Harvard College. Today, he returns as the first incumbent Vice President of the United States to be a Harvard commencement speaker and the recipient of an honorary degree. The intervening years have been a journey, from Harvard to Vietnam, then home to Tennessee and graduate study at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Vanderbilt Law School in Nashville. There, Al Gore, the former editor of the Dunster House newspaper, became a journalist for the Tennessean in Nashville. The former chair of the Harvard Freshman Council and member of the Harvard Undergraduate Council, was elected to 4 successive terms in the United States House of Representatives, was twice elected U.S. Senator, and then became Vice President of the United States. He married Mary Elizabeth Tipper Gore, and they became the parents of Corinna, class of '95, Kristen, Sarah, and Albert Gore III. Along the way, Vice President Gore became an expert and leader in issues of technology, arms control, and healthcare, and an advocate for consumers and taxpayers. His interest in education extended to service as an active and inspiring member of the Harvard Board of Overseers. The years have also been an intellectual and spiritual journey, as the insights Vice President Gore gained from Harvard professors such as Roger Revelle and Eric Erickson developed through new studies and insights into a profound concern for ecology and the human spirit. His bestseller book, Earth in the Balance, describes this journey and the conclusions to which it brought him. Near the end of the book, he writes, "Both in our personal lives and in our political decisions, we have an ethical duty to pay attention, resist distraction, be honest with one another, and accept responsibility for what we do, whether as individuals or together." It is a very great honor to introduce Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sharon Gagnon, President Neil Rudenstein and Angelica Rudenstein, members of the Harvard Corporation Board and Board of Overseers, faculty, students, alumni, distinguished guests. Before we begin, I would like to bring your attention to a small item on the inside cover of the June 4th issue of the Boston Globe magazine. Correction. The May 29th cover story on Vice President Al Gore suggested he is funny. He is not. The Globe regrets the error. I'm used to that. It's no secret that I ran for president in 1988, although it seemed like one at the time. It was a character-building experience. I learned a lot of new jokes. Al Gore is so boring. His Secret Service code name is Al Gore. If you use a strobe light, it looks like Al Gore is moving. Al Gore is so stiff, racks buy their suits off him. Al Gore is an inspiration to the millions of Americans who suffer from Dutch elm disease. How can you tell Al Gore from a room full of Secret Service agents? He is the stiff one. I've heard most of them, but every time I hear a new one, I always have the same reaction. Very funny, Tipper. In order to escape that demeaning ridicule and reclaim my dignity, I decided to run for Vice President of the United States of America. It has been an interesting experience, one which has not taken me entirely away from the Senate. You may have noticed that I've had a chance to vote a few times in the last 16 months. The experience has made me a more optimistic person because I've noticed a pattern that the news media has almost completely missed. But if you watch on C-SPAN, you will find this pattern holds. Every time I vote, we win. It works like a charm. A Harvard commencement is a special occasion. How could anyone not have been thrilled by this morning's assembly? 25,000 people packed into Harvard Yard to celebrate one of the great occasions of life. I loved it all, and I love this great gathering again, and I've especially enjoyed my 25th reunion. I am so proud of my class of 1969. We're the ones who beat Yale by a tie score, if you remember. I remember the 25th reunion class when they came in 1969, walking around the yard with their children. They seemed like ordinary people. They seemed older then than we seem now. But in fact, they were responsible for one of the saving triumphs of modern civilization. The class of 1944 was part of the generation President Clinton commemorated this week in Normandy, the group that went from Harvard to boot camp and basic training, and from there were transfused into the weary divisions battling across Europe. Only 11 members of the class were present at graduation. All the rest had by then already left to enlist. Some did not come back to their reunion. Their names are carved in stone in Memorial Church just behind me. Many did come back, and some of them are here again today for their 50th reunion and we salute you. Back in 1969, I have to say that our graduating class was in no mood to salute or to celebrate your sacrifice and your achievement. But we understand clearly, ever more so, without question, that because of your service, the world changed in 1944. Indeed, our world a half-century later is still shaped by the events of that tumultuous and triumphant year. Today, I want to tell you why I believe the world also changed in important and enduring ways because of the events of 1969, a year of contradiction and contrast, of glory and bitterness. In July 1969, 1/4 of the population of the world watched on live television while Neil Armstrong brought his space module Eagle down to the Sea of Tranquility, slowly climbed down a ladder and pressed his left boot into the untrod surface of the moon. But 1969 was also the year Charles Manson and his followers made the innocent words helter-skelter symbols of a bloodbath. 1969 was the year of music in the rain at Woodstock, and the year of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. While we went to class and heard lectures and wrote papers and listened to music and talked and played sports and fell in love, the war in Vietnam was blasting that small country apart physically and ripping America apart emotionally. A dark mood of uncertainty from that tragic conflict clouded every single day we were here. The year began with the inauguration of Richard Nixon, a ceremony that seemed to confirm for at least some of us the finality of a change in our national mood and ratify the results of what seemed like a downward spiral that had begun with the assassination of President Kennedy 5 years, 2 months, and 2 days earlier. Throughout our 4 years at Harvard, the nation's spirits sank. The race riot in Watts was fresh in our minds when we registered as freshmen. Though our hopes were briefly raised by the passage of civil rights legislation and the promise of a war on poverty, the war in Vietnam grew steadily more ominous and consumed the resources that were needed to make good on the extravagant promises for dramatic progress here at home. The year before our graduation, our hopes were once again briefly raised by the political insurgency we helped inspire and that we hoped might somehow end our national nightmare. Then, months later, those hopes were cruelly crushed by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., renewed race riots, this time nationwide, and then the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and what seemed like the death of any hope that we might find our way back to the entrance of the dark tunnel into which our nation had wandered. All of this cast a shadow over each of our personal futures. My personal attitudes toward the career I have chosen changed dramatically during that time. I left Harvard in 1969, disillusioned by what I saw happening in our country, and certain of only one thing about my future: I would never, ever go into politics. After returning from Vietnam and after 7 years as a journalist, I rekindled my interest in public service, but I believe the same disillusioning forces that for a time drove me away from politics have continued for the country as a whole. After all, the war raged on for 5 more years, and the downward spiral in our national mood reached a new low when the Watergate scandal led to the growing belief that our government was telling lies to our people. The resignation of President Nixon, his subsequent pardon, the oil shocks, 21% interest rates, hostages held seemingly interminably and then swapped in return for weapons provided to terrorists who called us the Great Satan, a quadrupling of our national debt in only a dozen years, a growing gap between rich and poor, steadily declining real incomes, all continued an avalanche of negative self-images which have profoundly changed the way Americans view their government. A recent analysis of public opinion polling data covering the years since my class came here to Harvard demonstrates the cumulative change in our national mood. When my class entered as freshmen in the fall of 1965, the percentage of Americans who believed that government generally tries to do the right thing was over 60%. Today, it is only 10%. The percentage of Americans believing then that government favors the rich and powerful was 29%. Today, it is 80%. These trends, let me emphasize, hold true for Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. This may be apocryphal, but someone actually claimed the other day that the situation has gotten so bad, they conducted a new poll and asked people about their current level of cynicism. 18% said they were more cynical than 5 years ago, 9% thought they were less cynical, and 72% suspected the question was some kind of government ploy and refused to answer. Democracy stands or falls on a mutual trust. Government's trust of the people and the people's trust of the governments they elect. And yet at the same time, democratic culture and politics have always existed in a strange blend of credulity and skepticism. Indeed, a certain degree of enduring skepticism about human nature lies at the foundation of our representative democracy. James Madison argued successfully in the Federalist Papers that the United States Constitution should create a protective balance of power among the factions that were bound to rise in any society. Democracy did not mean unity in the body politic. People do have reasonable differences. Human ignorance, pride, and selfishness would, after all, always be with us, prompting inevitable divisions and conflicting ambitions. Yet freedom and order could be protected with safeguards, ensuring that no one branch of government and no one group or faction would be able to dictate to all the rest. We were the first large republic to build a nation on the revolutionary premise that the people are sovereign and that the freedom to dispute, debate, disagree, and quarrel with each other created a fervent love of country that could hold us together against the world. It is still a revolutionary premise, and it is still built on a skeptical view of human nature that refuses to believe in perfection in intellect, logic, knowledge, or morals in any human being. And so the ceaseless American yearning for the ideal life has always stumbled uneasily over a persistent American skepticism about the parties and leaders who claim to have the wisdom and ability to guide us to our destiny. We revere our institutions, and at the same time we watch our leaders as though we were hawks circling overhead, eager to dive with claws extended onto any flaw or failure that we see. Even our most beloved president, George Washington, wrote in his last letter to Thomas Jefferson, dated July 6, 1796, "I had no conception that every act of my administration would be tortured in such exaggerated form and indecent terms as could scarcely be applied to a Nero, a notorious defaulter, or even a common pickpocket." Our feelings about ourselves as a people are mixed. We Americans have often been proud to the point of cocky arrogance, but we have never been able to hide indefinitely from what we do wrong. Our failures eat at our conscience, and our sins itch under the showy garb of our achievements and prevent us from being complacent. Faith in the future and skepticism about every person or group who offers to lead us there, these conflicting forces work together to shape the American character. And yet these forces must remain in a rough balance of emotional power. If we receive too heavy a dose of concentrated self-doubt and too many repetitive injuries to our confidence in self-government, then our normal, healthy skepticism can fall into a mire of cynicism, and we start to question the ability of any human community to live up to the democratic ideals that we proclaim. Once it is widely accepted, cynicism, the stubborn, unwavering disbelief in the possibility of good, can become a malignant habit in democracy. The skeptic may finally be persuaded by the facts, but the cynic never, for he is so deeply invested in the conviction that virtue cannot prevail over the deep and essential evil in all things and all people. The last time public cynicism sank to its present depth may have been exactly 100 years ago, when Mark Twain said, "There is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress." That was a time when Americans felt the earth moving under their feet. Debt and depression forced farmers off the land, and into cities they found cold and strange, and into factories where human beings became scarcely more than the extensions of machines. Cynicism was soon abroad in the land. We are now in the midst of another historic and unsettling economic transformation. Now the information revolution is leading to a loss of jobs in many factories as computers and automation replace human labor. After World War II, 35% of America's employment was on the factory floor. Today, fewer than 17% of our labor force works in manufacturing, with a larger output. Just as most of those who lost their jobs on the farm 100 years ago eventually found new work in factories, so today new jobs are opening up in new occupations created by the information revolution. But this time, the transition is taking place more swiftly, and the economic adjustment is, for many, more difficult and disorienting. In this respect, we Americans are actually doing better than most other nations. Every industrial society in the world is having enormous difficulty in creating a sufficient number of new jobs, even when their economies heat up. So, not surprisingly, public cynicism about leadership has soared in every industrial country throughout the world. History is a precarious source of lessons. Nevertheless, I am reminded that similar serious economic problems prevailed in Athens in the 4th century BC when the philosophical school we now know as Cynicism was born. The Cynics were fed up with their society and its social conventions and wanted everybody to know it. The root of the word cynic is the same as the Greek word for dog, and some scholars say the Cynics got their name because they barked at society. Sounds almost like some of our talk radio shows I've heard. In a time of social fragmentation, vulgarity becomes a way of life. To be shocking becomes more important and often more profitable than to be civil or creative or truly original. Given the vulgarity that fragmentation breeds, cynicism seems almost irresistible. Sometimes it even looks like a refuge of sanity, a rational response to a world seemingly driven by the fast hustle, the pseudo-event, the rage for sensationalism. In any event, cynicism represented then and represents now a secession from society, a dissolution of the bonds between people and families and communities, an indifference to the fate of anything or anyone beyond the self. Cynicism is deadly. It bites everything it can reach, like a dog with a foot caught in a trap, and then it devours itself. It drains us of the will to improve. It diminishes our public spirit. It saps our inventiveness. It withers our souls. Cynics often see themselves as merely being world-weary. There is no new thing under the sun, the cynics say. They have not only seen everything, they have seen through everything. They claim that their weariness is wisdom, but it is usually merely posturing. Their weariness seems to be most effective when they consider the aspirations of those beneath them who have neither power nor influence nor wealth. For these unfortunates, nothing can be done, the cynics declare. Hope for society as a whole is considered an affront to rationality. The notion that the individual has a responsibility for the community is considered a dangerous radicalism. And those who toil in quiet places and for little reward to lift up the fallen, to comfort the afflicted, and to protect the weak are regarded as fools. Ultimately, however, the life of a cynic is lonely and self-destructive. It is our human nature to make connections with other human beings. The gift of sympathy for one another is one of the most powerful sentiments we ever feel. If we do not have it, we're not human. Indeed, it is so powerful that the cynic who denies it goes to war with himself. A few years ago, Shelby Steele wrote about his pain as a child when he was mistreated by a teacher who called him stupid. He said that the teacher's declaration created a terrible reality for him. If the teacher told him he was stupid, he thought he must be stupid. Let me quote what he says. I mention this experience as an example of how one's innate capacity for insecurity is expanded and deepened, of how a disbelieving part of the self is brought to life and forever joined to the believing self. As children, we are all wounded in some way and to some degree by the wild world we encounter. From these wounds, a disbelieving anti-self is born, an internal antagonist and saboteur that embraces the world's negative view of us, that believes our wounds are justified by our own unworthiness, and that entrenches itself as a lifelong voice of doubt. Well, I believe that in a similar way, our nation's attitude toward itself can be and is shaped by national experiences. For example, the heady and triumphant victories of 1944 enlarged our confidence and helped us build the post-war world. And by contrast, during the days when my class was here at Harvard, America's capacity for insecurity was expanded and deepened by wounds to our national confidence. An unnamed alumnus of my class was quoted this morning on the front page of the Boston Globe as saying, "I lost faith in the United States as a force for good in the world." We are still trying to heal those wounds burned into our body politic by assassinations, the Vietnam War, the riots, the cultural conflicts, and by the terrible conviction that people sworn to uphold our Constitution were not telling us the truth. E.J. Dionne recently wrote, "Just as the Civil War dominated American political life for decades after it ended, so is the cultural Civil War of the 1960s, with all its tensions and contradictions, shaping our politics today." As the public's willingness to believe the worst increases, that is to say, as cynicism increases, the only political messages that seem to affect the outcome of elections are those that seek to paint the opposition as a gang of bandits and fools who couldn't be trusted to pour water out of a boot if the directions were written on the heel. This fixation on character assassination, rather than on defining issues, feeds the voracious appetite of tabloid journalism for scandal and the growing appetites of other journalistic outlets for the same sort of fare. A few years ago, the Czech leader Václav Havel wrote these prescient words: "They say a nation has the politicians it deserves. In some sense, that is true. Politicians are truly a mirror of the society and a kind of embodiment of its potential. At the same time, paradoxically, the opposite is also true. Society is a mirror of its politicians. It is largely up to the politicians which social forces they choose to liberate and which they choose to suppress, whether they choose to rely on the good in each citizen or on the bad. But it is crucial for us, and especially those of us in public service, to understand that cynicism also can arise when political leaders cavalierly promise to do good things and then fail to deliver. The inability to redeem glib and reckless promises about issues like education, race relations, and crime can add to the disturbing and growing doubts among the American people about our ability to shape our destiny. Over the long haul, sustainable hope is as important to the health of self-government as sustainable development is for ecological health. Dashed hopes poison our political will just as surely as chemical waste can poison drinking water aquifers deep in the ground. When hopes are repeatedly dashed and a nation's instinct for self-government is repeatedly injured, national cohesion can dissipate. The results are for all to see. At home and abroad, the weakening of bonds between the individual and the larger society creates a vacuum quickly filled by other group identities based on race or clan or sect or tribe or gang. Some distinguishing quality, often physical, is used to demarcate group identity. These differences become standards raised to summon the group to war against others slightly different from themselves. It is one of the strange perversities of this process that the smaller the difference, the more ferocious the hatred, and the more hideous the massacres that follow. Look at our bleeding world. Hutus versus Tutsis, Bosnian Serbs versus Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Muslims, all of whom often seem to others indistinguishable, but who themselves are driven to mindless ferocity by what Freud called the narcissism of slight difference, what St. Augustine called pride, the mother of all sins, and about which William Butler Yeats said in a famous poem, "Things fall apart, the sinner cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Make no mistake, just as repeated injuries to our national esteem can seriously jeopardize our ability to solve the problems which confront us, so at the global level, the convergence of too much chaos and horror in the world, of too many Bosnias and Rwandas, can seriously damage the ability of our global civilization to get a grip on the essential task of righting itself and regaining a measure of control over our destiny as a species. Where then do we search for healing? What is our strategy for reconciliation with our future? And where is our vision for sustainable hope? I have come to believe that our healing can be found in our relationships to one another and in a shared commitment to higher purposes in the face of adversity. At the 1992 Democratic Convention, I talked about a personal event that fundamentally changed the way I viewed the world, an accident that almost killed our son. I will not repeat the story here today, except to say that the most important lesson for me was that people I didn't even know reached out to me and to my family to lift us up in their hearts and in their prayers with compassion of such intensity that I felt it as a palpable force, a healing reaching out of those multitudes of caring souls and falling on us like a mantle of divine grace. Since then, I have dwelled on our connections to one another and on the fact that as human beings, we are astonishingly similar in the most important parts of our existence. I don't know what barriers in my soul had prevented me from understanding emotionally that basic connection to others until after they reached out to me in the dark of my family's sorrow. But I suppose it was a form of cynicism on my part. If cynicism is based on alienation and fragmentation, I believe the brokenness that separates the cynic from others is the outward sign of an inner division between the head and the heart. There is something icily and unnaturally intellectual about the cynic. This isolation of intellect from feelings and emotions is the essence of his condition. For the cynic, feelings are as easily separated from the reality others see as ethics are separated from behavior and as life is cut off from any higher purpose. Having felt their power in my own life, I believe that empathy and compassion are revolutionary forces in the world at large and that they are working now. A year after the accident, when our family's healing process was far advanced, I awoke early one Sunday morning in 1990, turned on the television set, and watched in amazement as another healing process began when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Last month, I attended his inauguration when he was sworn in as president of the new South Africa in what was a stupendous defeat for cynicism in our time. Many there were moved to tears. Many there were moved to tears as he introduced three special friends he had invited to attend the ceremony. His jailers, whom he had gotten to know across the chasm which divided him from them and with whom he had become personal friends. 9 months ago, I witnessed the healing power of a handshake on the south lawn of the White House as Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat began the tentative process of reconciliation and peace in a relationship hitherto characterized by only hatred and war. Less than 5 years ago, the world watched in amazement as the Berlin Wall was dismantled and statues of dictators toppled throughout East and Central Europe, and as authoritarian communist governments were replaced by market democracies alert to the needs of their people. Less than 3 weeks ago, for the first time in almost 50 years, nuclear missiles were no longer targeted on American cities, a small but important step in the continuing reversal of the nuclear arms race that has long served as the cynic's ace in the hole. There is, in other words, a respectable argument that the cynics who are barking so loudly are simply wrong. For my part, in the 25 years since my Harvard graduation, I have come to believe in hope over despair, striving over resignation, faith over cynicism. I believe in the power of knowledge to make the world a better place. Cynics may say human beings have never learned anything from history. All that is truly useful about knowledge is that it can provide you with advantages over the pack. But the cynics are wrong. We have the capacity to learn from our mistakes and transcend our past. Indeed, in this very place, we have been taught that truth, veritas, can set us free. I believe in finding fulfillment in family, for the family is the true center of a meaningful life. Cynics may say all families are confining and ultimately dysfunctional. The very idea of family is outdated and unworkable, but the cynics are wrong. It is in our families that we learn to love one another. I believe in serving God and trying to understand and obey God's will for our lives. Cynics may wave the idea away, saying God is a myth, useful in providing comfort to the ignorant and in keeping them obedient. I know in my heart, beyond all arguing and beyond any doubt, that the cynics are wrong. I believe in working to achieve social justice and freedom for all. Cynics may scorn this notion as naive, claiming that all our efforts for equal opportunity, for justice, for freedom, have created only a wasteland of failed hopes. But here too, the cynics are wrong. Freedom is our destiny, justice is our guide, and we shall overcome. I believe in protecting the Earth's environment against an unprecedented onslaught. Cynics may laugh out loud and say there is no utility in a stand of 1,000-year-old trees, a fresh breeze, or a mountain stream. But the cynics are wrong. We are part of God's creation and not separate from it. I believe in you, all of you here, individually and as a group. The cynics say you are motivated principally by greed, and that ultimately you will care for nothing other than yourselves. But the cynics are wrong. You care about each other, you cherish freedom, you treasure justice, you seek truth. And finally, I believe in America. Cynics will say we have lost our way, that the American century is at its end. But again, the cynics are wrong. America is still the model to which the world aspires. Almost everywhere in the world, the values that the United States has proclaimed, defended, and tried to live are now rising. In the end, we face a fundamental choice: cynicism or faith, each equally capable of taking root in our souls and shaping our lives as self-fulfilling prophecies. I believe we must open our hearts to each other